Emily Miller's discovery of her father Daniel's secret betrayal unleashed a spiral of lies, blackmail, and tragedy that turned their perfect suburban family into the center of a chilling true crime. The Miller family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. The houses were lined up neatly with well-kept lawns, and neighbors waved to each other as they passed. Daniel Miller, the father, was one of those men everyone trusted. He worked in finance, wore pressed suits, and often spoke about responsibility and values. His wife, Rachel, was admired for her kindness and commitment to the community. Their teenage daughter, Emily, was known as a bright student, polite, and hardworking. From the outside, they seemed like the picture of perfection, the kind of family others envied but also respected. No one would have guessed that, behind the closed doors of their home, something was about to happen that would leave scars no one could ignore. On that evening, Emily returned home earlier than usual. She had been at a friend's house working on a school project, but they finished sooner than expected. She walked back quietly, carrying her backpack, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. When she entered the house, the lights were dim, and there was an unusual silence. She thought perhaps her parents were out or her father was working late, which was a common occurrence, but then she noticed something strange. From the hallway, faint sounds reached her ears. They weren't the usual noises of a TV or a phone call. They were muffled, rhythmic, and unsettling. Curious but uneasy, Emily moved closer to the source of the sound. She walked carefully down the hall, her footsteps light on the carpet, until she reached her parents' bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for her to see inside without being noticed. What she saw froze her completely. Her father was inside the room, but he wasn't alone. Two women, neither of them her mother, were with him. The scene unfolding before her was raw and wild, something far beyond her comprehension. The man she had admired, the father she believed was devoted to his family, was betraying everything they stood for. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her backpack tightly against her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, and she felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't look away, even though every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. It was not just the act itself, but the shocking intensity of it. The betrayal magnified by the reckless carelessness with which her father had brought these women into the family home. She realized instantly that her life, her family, and her trust in the man she called father would never be the same again. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. She wanted to scream, to confront him, but fear silenced her. She imagined what would happen if he noticed her standing there. The thought terrified her. She turned slowly, her hands clammy, and tiptoed back down the hallway. Each step away felt heavier, as if she were carrying the weight of a truth too awful to bear. By the time she reached her room, tears had begun to stream down her face. She locked the door and buried her face in her pillow, trying to erase the image that kept replaying in her mind. For hours she lay in bed, unable to sleep, her thoughts spiraling into panic and disbelief. She wondered how long it had been happening, how many lies her father had told, and whether her mother had any idea. The house that once felt safe now felt suffocating and alien. She no longer recognized the man who lived under the same roof. He had become a stranger, someone capable of breaking their family apart in the most humiliating way possible. That night, Emily thought about telling her mother immediately, but she hesitated. What would she say? How could she describe what she had seen? She feared her mother wouldn't believe her, or worse, that it would break her completely. The fear of destroying her family held her in silence. She knew the truth, but she carried it alone, like a heavy stone pressing against her chest. As the hours passed and the house grew quiet again, Emily realized something else. What she had witnessed wasn't just a mistake or a fleeting moment of weakness. It was deliberate, reckless, and brazen. Her father had chosen this path, knowing the risks, and he hadn't even tried to hide it. That thought chilled her more than anything else. It meant he didn't care if he was caught. It meant he was living a double life, one that could explode at any moment and drag them all into the wreckage. When morning came, the world outside continued as usual. Rachel, cheerful and unsuspecting, asked Emily about her project, while Daniel nodded absent-mindedly, giving no indication of the secret he was hiding. Emily sat there quietly, her throat tight, feeling like she was trapped in a play where everyone else was following a script, and only she knew the terrible truth. The day dragged on at school, but Emily couldn't focus. Every time she closed her eyes, the image replayed in vivid detail. It gnawed at her, a constant reminder that her father was not who she thought he was. By the time she came home, she was exhausted, but the tension in the house was unbearable. She avoided him whenever possible, retreating to her room, locking the door, and replaying the moment in her mind again and again. Emily didn't know it then, but her decision to stay silent would only give the secret more power. It would grow like a shadow, creeping into every corner of their lives until it consumed them. She thought she could contain it, bury it deep inside, but secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface. And this one, dark and dangerous, was far too explosive to remain hidden forever. The foundation of their family had cracked that night, even if no one else realized it yet. The perfect image of the Millers was shattered in Emily's eyes, replaced by suspicion, shame, and fear. What she had seen was more than just betrayal, it was the start of something she couldn't control, something that would spiral into a nightmare of lies, anger, and ultimately crime. Emily carried the weight of what she had witnessed in silence, and the days that followed felt heavy, as if she were walking through a fog no one else could see. Every glance at her father made her stomach tighten, and every smile he gave her mother seemed like a cruel performance. She struggled to concentrate at school, her mind always drifting back to the night she stumbled upon that awful scene. The house no longer felt like home, but a stage where lies were dressed up as normal life. Rachel, her mother, carried on as usual, laughing at small things and talking about errands, unaware of the storm building around her. But Emily's silence couldn't last forever. The truth had a way of seeping out, even when she tried to hold it in. One afternoon, Emily met her closest friend Hannah, who immediately noticed something was wrong. Emily's pale face and distracted eyes betrayed her unease. Hannah pressed her until the words finally spilled out. Emily told her everything in a rushed whisper, her hands trembling as she described the moment she had walked in on her father. Hannah sat in shock, not knowing what to say. She promised to keep it a secret, but the weight of such a revelation was too heavy for her to bear. And just like that, what had been a private burden began to spread. Hannah didn't mean to betray Emily, but in a moment of panic and curiosity, she confided in another friend. Within days, whispers spread through the school. Rumors twisted the truth into something darker, and soon Emily felt the sting of curious stares and hushed voices whenever she walked past groups of students. She had never felt so exposed. It wasn't just her father's betrayal that tormented her now, but the judgment of others. The scandal had leaked into the world, and it was only a matter of time before it reached her mother's ears. Rachel noticed her daughter's strange behavior and the sudden distance between her and Daniel. Then came the whispers from neighbors and acquaintances. They were subtle at first, odd remarks and hesitant questions, but they quickly grew into louder suspicions. Rachel, confused and unsettled, confronted Emily one evening, demanding to know the truth. Caught between fear and loyalty, Emily broke down. Through sobs, she revealed what she had seen. The words cut through Rachel like a blade, leaving her trembling with disbelief. At first, Rachel refused to accept it. She insisted Emily must have been mistaken, that her imagination had played tricks on her. But the conviction in Emily's voice and the pain in her eyes left no room for denial. Rachel felt her world tilt, as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. She couldn't breathe. The man she had trusted, the partner she believed was devoted, had betrayed her in the most humiliating way possible, and in their own home. The confrontation with Daniel came quickly. Rachel demanded answers, and Daniel denied everything. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, as he insisted Emily was wrong. He claimed she must have misinterpreted something or imagined it entirely. His confidence only deepened Rachel's confusion. She wanted to believe him, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew rapidly. Her daughter had no reason to lie. The tension in the house became unbearable, with Rachel torn between disbelief and fury, and Emily sinking deeper into despair. Rachel's doubt soon turned into suspicion. She began watching Daniel more closely, noticing the late nights, the sudden business trips, the guarded way he handled his phone. Every small detail began to stand out, painting a picture she had once refused to see. Her heart broke with each discovery, but she couldn't stop herself from digging deeper. One night, when Daniel left his phone unattended, Rachel seized the chance. Her hands shook as she scrolled through messages and photos, uncovering evidence that left her numb. There were hidden accounts, secret conversations, and pictures of him with women she had never seen before. The truth Emily had spoken was undeniable. Rachel felt a surge of anger mixed with humiliation. This wasn't just a husband's betrayal. It was calculated deception, carried out with arrogance and carelessness. He had lived a double life right under her nose, and she had been blind to it. The rage boiled inside her, but fear soon followed. Some of the women in the photos didn't look like ordinary companions. They had a hardness in their eyes, a dangerous edge. The messages hinted at meetings that were not just intimate but entangled with shady dealings. This wasn't simply infidelity, it was a path into something darker. Meanwhile, Emily's guilt grew heavier. She felt responsible for the chaos that had engulfed their home, even though she had only spoken the truth. She withdrew further from her friends, avoiding their questions and whispers. Nights were sleepless, filled with nightmares of her father's face turning into a stranger's. Her grades began to slip, and teachers noticed her decline. But Emily didn't care. She felt trapped in a house poisoned by lies and fear. Rachel, determined to uncover the full extent of Daniel's betrayal, began following his movements. She checked receipts, tracked his absences, and pieced together a puzzle she wished she had never started. What she discovered terrified her. Daniel wasn't simply cheating. He was involved with people who carried reputations far more sinister than lovers hiding in the shadows. There were hints of debts, hidden transactions, and dangerous alliances. Rachel realized she had not just been betrayed as a wife, she and her daughter were being pulled into something criminal. The thought haunted her. She lay awake at night, listening to the sound of Daniel's footsteps in the hallway, wondering who he really was. The man she once trusted with her life had become a stranger capable of leading them into danger. She feared what would happen if she confronted him again. If he was desperate enough, could he silence her? Could he put Emily at risk to protect himself? These questions gnawed at her until she felt like she was losing her grip on reality. Daniel carried on with an unsettling calm, as though nothing were wrong. He laughed at dinner, made casual conversation, and played the role of the devoted husband and father. But behind that calm exterior was a man cornered by secrets. Emily watched him closely, her fear mixing with anger. She no longer saw him as her father, but as a liar who had destroyed their family. Every interaction felt like a performance, and she couldn't escape the image burned into her mind. Rachel knew she could not stay silent. She began documenting everything she found: screenshots, receipts, notes on his behavior. She didn't know whether she was preparing to confront him again, seek legal help, or go to the authorities. All she knew was that the life she thought she had built was over, and the man she once loved was dragging them into a darkness she hadn't yet begun to understand. What Emily had witnessed had opened a door that could never be closed. The truth had surfaced, and now it was pulling them all into deeper waters. Rachel realized that her daughter's discovery was only the beginning. Something far more dangerous was waiting, hidden in Daniel's secret world, and it was only a matter of time before it came crashing into theirs. Rachel's discovery of Daniel's secret life sent her into a spiral of fear and confusion. The evidence she had uncovered on his phone proved without question that Emily had been telling the truth, but the implications stretched far beyond marital betrayal. What unsettled her most were not the intimate photos and messages, but the strange references buried in conversations, cryptic mentions of payments, meetings in secluded locations, and coded words that hinted at something illegal. Some of the names attached to those messages rang faint bells. Men with reputations whispered about in the community, men associated with crime and violence. Rachel realized she wasn't simply dealing with a cheating husband. She was staring at a web of danger that reached far beyond their home. Her first instinct was to confront him again, but fear kept her silent. Daniel was not acting like the man she had once known. His charm and calm manner now seemed like a mask covering something far more sinister. If she pushed too hard, she didn't know what he might do. She began living in a state of constant tension, hiding her discoveries while pretending everything was normal. At night, when she heard his key turn in the lock, her body stiffened and her thoughts raced with paranoia. Emily noticed her mother's nervous glances and began to sense that their home had become unsafe in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Emily, meanwhile, was collapsing under the weight of her father's betrayal. At school, the whispers had not stopped. The rumor of her father's affairs had spread so widely that even teachers seemed to look at her differently, as though she carried the shame of his actions. She withdrew from her friends, avoided social gatherings, and spent long hours alone in her room. Her once bright personality dimmed into something quieter and sadder, and she often cried herself to sleep. She tried to distract herself by keeping a journal, writing down everything she knew and everything she suspected. It became her way of controlling the chaos, documenting what she feared might one day be important if everything fell apart. Rachel noticed Emily's suffering but felt powerless to protect her. She wanted to shield her from the darkness surrounding them, but how could she when she herself was drowning in it? The photograph she had found haunted her, but the fear of the criminal connections weighed even heavier. She began driving past places Daniel claimed to be working late, only to find no sign of him. Once, she followed him discreetly and watched as he met a woman in a dark parking lot. Their interaction didn't seem like a simple affair. The woman handed him a small envelope, and Daniel looked around nervously before slipping it into his jacket. Rachel gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She realized she was witnessing more than infidelity. She was seeing a man entangled in something dangerous enough to ruin them all. When Daniel returned home that night, he acted calm and casual, greeting them as though nothing unusual had happened. Rachel stared at him in silence, wondering how many lies he had told and how many dangers lurked behind his charming smile. She began to wonder if they were being watched. Little things unsettled her, a car idling outside their street for too long, unfamiliar faces at the grocery store, the feeling of eyes following her when she left the house. She dismissed them at first as paranoia, but the fear refused to leave. Emily's journal grew longer, filled with details about her father's movements, his late returns, and her mother's anxious behavior. She didn't want to keep it secret, but she was terrified of speaking to anyone beyond the pages of her notebook. She sometimes thought of going to the authorities, but she feared no one would believe her. After all, she was just a teenager. Her father was a respected man in the community, someone people admired. Who would believe her story over his polished lies? Still, the thought remained in the back of her mind, whispering that she might one day need to hand over her notes as proof of what she knew. One evening, Rachel decided she could no longer stay passive. She confronted Daniel in a careful but direct way, pressing him about his late nights and the strange messages she had seen. He reacted with anger at first, but then his demeanor shifted into something quieter, almost desperate. He admitted, in vague terms, that he had gotten himself into trouble. He owed money to men who were not forgiving, and his involvement with certain women was not about desire alone. They were leverage connected to those who controlled him. Rachel listened in shock as he confessed that he was trapped. If he tried to break away, they would hurt him, and worse, they might come after his family. Rachel was horrified, but she also realized that his words explained the fear she had been sensing. Her instincts had been right. They weren't safe. Still, Daniel offered no solution, only excuses. He told her to stay quiet and let him handle it, but Rachel could see he was drowning. He was not in control. He was being controlled? She wanted to take Emily and leave, but where could they go? If these men were dangerous enough to threaten them, running might only make them targets. What Rachel didn't realize was that her own search for the truth had not gone unnoticed. Her movements were being tracked. When she followed Daniel, when she checked his messages, someone had been watching her. The men Daniel owed were careful about who knew too much, and Rachel's curiosity had drawn attention. She began receiving subtle warnings. Once, she found her car window slightly open, though she was certain she had locked it. Another time, she came home to find the back gate ajar, even though she always checked it. Then came the most chilling moment, a phone call with no voice on the other end, only silence and then a click. She felt her blood run cold, realizing it wasn't a random call, it was a message. Her fear grew, but she couldn't share all of it with Emily, who was already fragile. Instead, she carried it alone, growing more paranoid each day. She slept lightly, listening for sounds in the house, her heart racing at every creak of the floorboards. She double-checked locks, closed curtains tightly, and avoided leaving the house at night. Emily sensed the change even without being told. She saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the exhaustion in her face. She began to suspect that whatever her father was involved in was darker than just affairs. Her nightmares became more vivid, filled with images of strangers breaking into their home, of her father disappearing, of her mother crying out for help. She poured these fears into her journal, creating a chilling record of her family's slow descent into chaos. The truth hung heavy over them, too large to hide, too dangerous to speak. Rachel knew they were standing at the edge of something that could shatter their lives completely. She wanted to believe she could still find a way out, but deep down she feared the worst. She had uncovered too much, asked too many questions, and now they were all caught in a web that grew tighter with each passing day. The Miller household had become a place of tension, the kind of tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The walls seemed to carry secrets, the silence between family members filled with unspoken truths and fears. Rachel moved through the house with unease, glancing out windows as though expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Daniel was rarely home, and when he was, he acted as if nothing was wrong. He maintained his calm, smiling when he needed to, pretending life was normal, but underneath that mask Rachel could see cracks forming. He was growing restless, his temper short, his phone always in his hand. Emily sensed the change most of all. She kept her distance from her father, and the memory of what she had witnessed continued to haunt her. She was old enough to see the lies, but young enough to feel powerless against them. It was during one of those long nights that Rachel began to notice patterns. A car would appear outside at the same time every evening, headlights dimmed, engine humming quietly. It never stayed long, but it returned night after night. At first, she convinced herself it was a coincidence, perhaps a neighbor's guest. But when the same vehicle came back 3 nights in a row and lingered longer each time, she knew it was deliberate. She felt a chill run through her as she realized someone was watching them. She didn't mention it to Emily at first, but her fear deepened. Each time she passed the window and caught a glimpse of the car, her chest tightened, and she had to force herself to breathe. The situation worsened when a package appeared on their doorstep one morning. It was unmarked, a plain brown box with no return address. Rachel hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling as she peeled back the tape. Inside, she found a single photograph. It was of Emily walking home from school, her backpack slung over her shoulder. The picture had been taken from a distance, but it was clear, too clear. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Someone had been following her daughter, watching her closely enough to capture this moment. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. They knew where Emily was, and they wanted Rachel and Daniel to know it. Rachel confronted Daniel with the photo, demanding answers, but his reaction only deepened her fear. He looked terrified, his calm demeanor breaking for the first time. He admitted what she had already suspected, that the people he owed money to weren't simply criminals, they were ruthless. He had been given warnings before, but now the threats were aimed directly at his family. Rachel felt sick as she realized how deeply he had dragged them all into this. He insisted there was nothing they could do, that going to the authorities would make things worse, that silence was the only way to keep Emily safe. Rachel wanted to scream, to demand that he take responsibility, but the fear of losing her daughter's safety silenced her. Emily eventually learned about the photo when Rachel could no longer keep it from her. The revelation shattered what little sense of security she had left. She began looking over her shoulder constantly, afraid to walk alone, terrified of strangers who passed her on the street. Her journal became darker, filled with entries about fear, about shadows that seemed to follow her, about the growing suspicion that her father had placed them all in a cage with invisible bars. The threats were no longer just whispers in the background. They were real, tangible, and dangerous. Inside the house, paranoia took hold. Rachel locked every door twice, pulled curtains shut even in the daytime, and rarely let Emily out of her sight. Emily, in turn, grew resentful of the constant restrictions, but deep down she understood. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped not by walls but by the shadow of her father's mistakes. At school, she tried to pretend everything was normal, but her fear bled through. Teachers noticed her distraction, her declining grades, the way she startled at sudden noises. Her friends pulled away, unable to understand what was happening. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior grew stranger. He stayed out later, came home smelling of smoke and cheap perfume, and avoided eye contact whenever Rachel pressed him for answers. His phone calls were short and whispered, often taken outside or in the garage. Rachel could see the stress eating away at him, but she could also see his refusal to face reality. He was in too deep, and now his desperation made him reckless. She feared what he might do next, whether he might drag them even further into danger in a misguided attempt to fix what he had broken. Then came the night Rachel was certain they were no longer just being watched, but actively targeted. She woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside the house. Quiet, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. The footsteps circled the house, crunching against the gravel, pausing under Emily's window before moving on. Rachel's skin prickled with fear. She wanted to scream for Daniel, but she was too afraid of making a sound. She held her breath until the footsteps finally faded away. The next morning she found footprints in the dirt outside, proof that someone had been there. Daniel dismissed it as kids playing around, but Rachel knew better. It was a warning, another reminder that they were trapped. The weight of fear pressed heavier with each day. Emily began to dream about faceless figures breaking into their home, about her father vanishing without a trace, about her mother crying in the dark. She woke up sweating, her heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that the nightmares were creeping closer to reality. She began to write more frantically in her journal, filling pages with details, convinced that if something happened, her words would be the only truth left behind. Rachel, on the other hand, began to consider desperate options. She thought about leaving Daniel, taking Emily and disappearing before the threats turned violent. But she knew the men watching them would not let go so easily. They had already proven they could reach her daughter, and the photo haunted her with every breath. Running might only provoke them further, yet staying felt like waiting for disaster. She was caught between impossible choices, both of them dangerous. Daniel continued to insist he could manage the situation, but Rachel no longer believed him. His eyes gave him away. Filled with fear, he tried to mask with forced calm. She realized he was as much a victim as he was guilty. He had gotten himself trapped in a world where debts and betrayal were paid for in blood. And now the noose was tightening, not only around his neck, but around all of theirs. Every moment felt like borrowed time. The house became a fortress of fear, each sound a potential threat, each day a countdown to something inevitable. Rachel and Emily lived in constant dread, while Daniel drowned in secrets and shame. The life they once knew was gone, replaced by a nightmare that refused to end. And though Rachel clung to hope that there might still be a way out, deep down she feared that the worst was yet to come, and that their family was heading toward a breaking point they could no longer avoid. The tension inside the Miller household had reached a point where every sound felt like an omen. Days bled into nights filled with silence, unease, and the constant fear that the next knock on the door would shatter what little remained of their fragile world. Rachel barely slept anymore, her mind replaying the photograph of Emily over and over. The image had burned itself into her memory, a cruel reminder that danger lurked just beyond their walls. Emily had withdrawn almost completely, her journal clutched tightly as if it were the only place she could speak freely. She scribbled long into the night, convinced that the act of writing could protect her from the shadows closing in. Daniel drifted further from them both, disappearing for hours, sometimes for days, returning only to mutter vague reassurances that meant nothing anymore. He had grown thinner, his eyes sunken and hollow, as if the weight of his choices was physically consuming him. The breaking point came on a rainy evening when Rachel noticed another package on the doorstep. Unlike the first, this one was heavier. She brought it inside with trembling hands, her heart racing. Inside she found not one photograph, but several. They showed Emily at different times, in different places, walking to school, sitting in her classroom, playing in the yard. The images were intimate, taken with precision, proving that whoever was watching had been following her closely for weeks. But one photo was different. It showed Emily asleep in her own bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp visible in the corner of the frame. Rachel's blood ran cold as she realized what that meant. Someone had been inside the house. She confronted Daniel the moment he returned that night. He could not deny it anymore. His hands shook as he admitted that the men had grown impatient. He had failed to pay back what he owed, and now they wanted more than money. The threats had escalated, and the photo of Emily sleeping was their way of proving they could reach her any time they wanted. Rachel's fury turned to despair. She had begged him to protect their daughter, and now he was admitting that he had lost control entirely. She no longer saw him as her husband, but as the very reason their lives were collapsing. Emily overheard more than she should have. She stayed hidden at the top of the stairs, listening as her mother cried and her father begged for understanding. She realized then that the journal she kept, the pages filled with her fears and suspicions, were not simply private thoughts. They were evidence, a record of the truth. She wrote that night with a kind of desperation she had never felt before, her words frantic, her hand aching from pressing the pen too hard against the paper. She wrote about the men who watched her, about the photograph, about the footsteps outside her window. She even wrote about her father's late-night phone calls and whispered promises, as though she knew that someday someone would need to understand what had happened to her. The following night, the danger moved from shadows into reality. Rachel woke to the sound of breaking glass. Her heart seized as she rushed to Emily's room, only to find the window shattered and curtains billowing in the wind. Emily was gone. Panic tore through Rachel as she screamed her daughter's name, her voice echoing through the darkened house. Daniel stumbled from his room, his face drained of all color as he realized what had happened. For all his assurances, for all his empty promises, he had failed at the one thing that mattered most. The police were called, but Rachel quickly realized that their involvement would only complicate things. Daniel begged her not to tell them everything, insisting that revealing the truth about his debts would put Emily in even greater danger. Rachel wanted to fight him, to scream that he was wrong, but time was slipping away. Every second Emily was gone felt like a lifetime. She knew they were dealing with people who did not negotiate with compassion, only with power and fear. Hours stretched into a day, then two. Rachel barely ate, barely slept, clinging to the hope that her daughter was still alive. Daniel vanished again, claiming he was meeting with the men to bargain for Emily's return. Rachel no longer trusted him, no longer believed he had the strength to save her. She began to fear that he might sacrifice them all just to save himself. On the third day, Rachel found Emily's journal hidden under her pillow. She read through the pages, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the raw, terrified words her daughter had left behind. Emily had been living in fear for months, long before Rachel had noticed the signs. She had known about the car, the watchers, even the footsteps at night. Her final entries were filled with dread, as though she sensed the moment of her disappearance was coming. The last line struck Rachel with devastating force. "If something happens to me, it's because of him." The him was obvious. Emily had known her father's mistakes would cost her everything. That evening, Rachel received a phone call from an unknown number. A man's voice, low and cold, told her that Emily was alive for now. They demanded payment, more than Daniel could ever provide, and warned her that if she involved anyone else, Emily would not return. Rachel listened in silence, her hands trembling, her mind screaming, but she dared not interrupt. When the call ended, she collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. Daniel returned hours later, his shirt stained, his face bruised. He claimed he had tried to fight, tried to resist, but the men were too powerful. He admitted that he could not fix it. Rachel stared at him, hatred burning in her chest. For the first time, she saw him not as her husband, but as the enemy who had destroyed their family. In that moment, she made a choice. She would no longer wait for him to save Emily. She would find a way herself, even if it meant betraying him. The house grew quieter after that. Rachel stopped speaking to Daniel except when necessary. She contacted the police again, this time without telling him, desperate for someone to listen, someone to take the danger seriously. She provided the photographs, the package, even Emily's journal, hoping that together they would be enough to spark action. But before any resolution could come, tragedy struck. A week after Emily's disappearance, her body was found in a shallow grave outside town. The discovery shattered Rachel completely. She collapsed at the news, unable to comprehend how the nightmare had ended in such horror. The police quickly turned their attention to Daniel, uncovering his debts, his lies, his connection to the men who had orchestrated the abduction. Rachel's grief was consumed by rage as she testified against him, determined to ensure that he bore the weight of his actions. Emily's journal became the most important piece of evidence. Her words painted the story of a family destroyed by secrets, of a daughter who had known more than anyone realized, a fear that had lived within her until the very end. The pages were stained with tears, but they carried the truth. And when Daniel was finally arrested, Rachel felt no relief, only the hollow ache of knowing it had come too late to save her child. The Miller household fell silent, a place once filled with life now reduced to memories and shadows. The walls still held the echoes of fear, the weight of secrets, and the devastating loss that could never be undone. For Rachel, there was no closure, no peace, only the haunting knowledge that everything had been preventable if the man she trusted most had not led them down a path from which there was no return.